For our final episode of season 3 on the Extraordinary Leaders podcast, I wanted to pull together some threads from the season so far. And the guests that I've had on have all shared extra things in their leadership that we can borrow and adopt into our ordinary spaces of how we're ordinarily doing things that by accident might make us quite extraordinary, because the journey with leadership is growth. And something that Helen Brocklebank shared with us on season 3 is that in the spaces of luxury where she works, the luxury sector, she says that the great leaders are the ones that are facing big challenges and they don't answer it with, I can't, or, oh, help, we can't. They answer it with, how can we?
I never ever hear any one of those CEOs saying, we can't. I always, when things become impossible, they say, well, how can we?
Yeah.
How can we do this? And so that, I think, is, I mean, it really is the great privilege of my life and certainly my career to spend that time with those kinds of leaders and hearing those kinds of qualities. So extraordinary leadership is those things.
Now, this is like basic growth fixed mindset 101, but I want to draw our attention to it because it's something we're so familiar with but kind of forget. And I have some props here. So for me, I have got, pretend they're real, I have got a bunch of flowers and I have a pot plant in my hands. The bunch of flowers, as we look at them, they are as good as they will ever be because they have been plucked from their life source. So this bunch of flowers is never going to get better. In fact, it'll probably only get worse. But this is as good as it's ever going to be. It's a finite thing. It's a statement that will end. And this is the fixed mindset. When we say things like, I can't, that'll never work, Richard in accounts is a nightmare, oh, that team is useless, those kind of comments sit upon a belief system of a fixed mindset. That's all it's ever going to be. There's no growth. There's nowhere to maneuver with that. It's a roadblock. And that mindset is really a hindrance to finding your way through challenges in leadership. The growth mindset, on the other hand, is more like this potted plant, whereby if I tend to it and I nurture it and I find out what it needs, what kind of soil it needs, how much water it needs, does it need any extra growth, sort of special chemicals putting in, that tending to it as a journey is something that means that the potential of this plant can grow into something it's not yet, but it can become something different. That is the ultimate growth mindset. So when Helen is referring to CEOs who say, what can we do about this? That is what the pot plant is versus we can't, which is the flowers. And so in our leadership, in our approaches, I know that in my own life, when I changed from being a stay-at-home mother of 4 with as a vicar's wife, my CV was pretty thin. And now I'm working in businesses full time for the past 5 years. How did that happen? Well, the fixed mindset would have said you can't, stay in your lane, you're a mum, you haven't got a CV, you're not going to be that effective. But the growth mindset was to go, okay, what do I need to learn? Who do I need to speak to? Who could help me on this quest of reaching into businesses and impacting team dynamics and leadership dynamics? And it came through conversations. It came through a growth. Always, I believe, growth comes through conversations. It comes from asking questions and actually being able to be humble enough to hear the answers and to take it on board, to take on board candor, difficult feedback, to take on board encouragement, to take on board, try this, try that. And it's through that we can then grow into great places. We had some great guests on this season of the Extraordinary Leaders podcast. And one I want to draw our attention to is one of my favorites, Gareth from Bank. And in banking, such a regulated space with targets right up here, how do we become extraordinary in our leadership to create high-performing teams? Well, something that Gareth said is they celebrate failure, which is an interesting one because that's a nice to have. But when failure is happening, I don't know about you, I actually hate failure. You feel shame, you feel embarrassment, you feel like you should have done better. So is it in the moment of failure that you can celebrate it, or is it in the aftermath that we need to look at? Let's have a listen to what Gareth says.
One of the big shocks I think that I had when I first joined Alica was just how much we celebrated and valued failure, which working in big banks for many years as I had, the idea that you'd ever fail was a terrifying thought to me.
Well, in banking, yeah.
And of course, we are heavily regulated. We are privileged to be supporting and helping people to manage their finances. So when I talk about failure, it's not the bank is going to break tomorrow. We have all the checks and balances, the due process. We will do everything that you would expect a bank to do. But from a mindset perspective, there is this strongly held belief that we should celebrate people who try, people who experiment, and people that fall flat on their faces from having done so. And I think that's so often lacking across businesses in so many different industries, because to your point, I think we are taught from a very young age to firstly ask for permission, and then secondly, that failure or making mistakes is bad.
There's a principle that I've learned, which I find really helpful. When we're thinking about failure, we don't want to break the bank. So we don't want everyone having autonomy to just try everything and fail. But there's a great principle called the waterline. And if you imagine a ship or a boat, any hole that happens below the waterline is a problem. It could sink the ship. Any hole above the waterline isn't probably going to sink the ship. It will need tending to, but it's not going to break it's not going to sink the boat. And so when we're thinking about failure as a team leader, what failures are we trying to avoid that we have to avoid? And what failures can we permit? Sometimes that paradigm of the waterline can help us ask simply the question as a common language. Is this an above the waterline or a below the waterline issue? If it's above the waterline, we can give our teams autonomy to just go and try. If it's below the waterline, we might have to become a little bit more tactical about it. Something I heard from a colleague not long ago was that they'd been in a company that has a debrief failure room where they celebrate. So after any failure, without the shame of it, they go into the failure celebration debrief room and they thrash it through. They thrash out what they could have done differently. What did they learn? What principles can they apply to the next thing where it doesn't happen again? And that room is used time and time again. And it's become a really normal part of their culture that, we're going to go to the failure celebrate room so that we can debrief this really effectively. On the back end of failure, that shame we feel, that worry, when you've sent the wrong email or you've misquoted or you've mispriced, these small failings that actually come back at you and make you feel like you've undermined yourself in your leadership role or in your career is a real trigger for stress. I know that I hate that feeling. So when people talk about celebrate failure, you can't do it when you're right in the middle of it. It's way too hard. When you're in the middle of it, you're triggered, you feel shame, embarrassed. And depending on the culture around you, it's hard to share sometimes. Well, I spoke to Cathy O'Dowd, who is the first female to climb Everest from both sides. It's an amazing episode. I'd really encourage you to listen to that one. And Cathy talks about how we need to master stress. So stress comes at us on a very biochemical level. It hits the back of our brain here where we've got our primitive part where we release hormones to make us want to fight, flight, freeze, run away. But she says when that happens, we need to master it. Let's listen to what she says.
The breathing thing is astonishing. If you ever have the time, you can actually sit there, do the breathing and watch your pulse rate lower as you are doing it. If you can get attuned to your body, you can actually feel your stress reactions lowering as you breathe your way into a state of calm. I think my other one is just kind of self-awareness. Know how you tend to react to stress. If you really think and it can help to just warn people, like, as a woman, sorry, this is the kind of thing that can bring me to tears. It's not a problem. I mean, if you're the kind of guy who gets angry, you'd at least tell people, I need to walk down the corridor for 5 minutes. And then I'll come back into the room. Go and walk your anger out. something like that. So know yourself realistically, and possibly help to talk people through what you're about to do, and then you will rejoin the meeting in a minute.
Really fascinating, isn't it, that we can just sit and breathe and feel our biochemistry come back into regulation. The power of that is that when we are in fast-paced business, we need to understand how to biohack our bodies, because otherwise we'll be operating out of a fight, flight, freeze response. And so we want to get into this part of the brain, the front part. And in order to do so, that's where our great decisions are made and our cognitive ability kind of comes back online. Breathing well, breathing deeply, lowering your heart rate gets us back online to be a decisive, effective leader, so that we can manage any problems that we are facing, any roadblocks. And something she says that I find fascinating is you've got to know what you're like in stress. And we all talk about self-awareness. And I would argue that if you say, oh, I know I get a bit impatient or I get a bit angry when I'm stressed, I would say that's not self-awareness. That is stating the obvious. Self-awareness is when you are able to sit on the other side of that and have empathy for what it's like for those around you. Because when you get stressed, or let's say you shut down and become really quiet, what's it like on the other side of you? You will be creating a reality around you that you don't even know you're doing. People will be scared of you. People will think you're moody. People won't want to come to you. People will feel you're unapproachable. And the very heart as a leader is that we are approachable, that we are decisive, that we have our people's ears. So self-awareness is such a key component to leadership. And if you don't know your personality preferences and profile well, I'm not talking about a light touch, just doing color insights, for example, which is a great tool, by the way. But if you as a leader want to take it seriously and you don't know how you make decisions, how you function in stress, what your personality does in stress, how you like to communicate, what your preference is, where your gaps are in your communication style, because you've had candid feedback. If you don't know those basic things, I would suggest you don't have self-awareness. And that is a massive opportunity for you right now, going back to growth mindset, tending to the plant. Go and find a coach. I can help you. I know plenty of other coaches I can refer you to who will help you go on a 3-hour journey. That's all it would take to really understand how you behave and how you function, to give you that awareness so that you're then able to make different choices and create a different output in your leadership style. If we can master the stresses that come at us in our business life, if we can recognize and have self-awareness, we're then going to be in a much stronger position to spring forward, which brings me on to a great extract from a conversation I had with Russell Harvey.
That's why I hammer the message of resilience is springing forward with learning, because the behavioral norm that you need to get into to achieve that is pausing and re-energizing and reflecting.
So pausing almost sounds like a paradox to springing forward.
Indeed, it does. Absolutely. So, but pausing can mean a coaching conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, that's pausing. It's literally having a chat with somebody. Pausing could be mindfulness. Pausing could be going to the gym. Pausing could be baking a cake. Pausing could be a team meeting where we go, literally, we're going to sit around here today and we're going to have a reflective conversation. We're pausing. Yeah. And we're going to have a reflective conversation about this and really understand actually what's going well and what isn't and what we need to do about it and what we're going to learn from it. So pausing can be active. So, yeah, it totally can sound like an oxymoron, essentially. Yeah. To be able to move forward, you have to find what's the way for you to pause. And that, for me, that's where the coaching comes in. Because 100%. As you know, and I know, my clients say to me, type of conversations I have with you, Russell, I don't have them with anybody else. And I go, great. Can you tell me more about what that is? I don't know. I seem to sort stuff out in my head and my heart. Yes. And I go somewhere different with it, and it's better. And so that's why you need your coaching conversations, essentially. Yeah.
I love this paradox that Russell talks about, springing forward into learning, but there has to be a pausing just beforehand. If we're just springing forward all the time from one thing to the next, it's a bit like that game, that fairground game. I refer to it in my book, the whack-a-croc at the fairgrounds, when you whack, 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 whack. We become hyper-vigilant, just ping, 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 ping. And we lose the ability to debrief, to reflect, to pull back and decide, where do I need to apply my resources most effectively? And Russ makes a really good point, coupled with what I touched on before about you need to know yourself. You also need to have time with a coach or with a colleague or a friend to really debrief life. Our lives are so busy. And did you know that cognitive overload is worse for your brain than marijuana and sleep deprivation? All of this springing forward without pausing is actually problematic for our brain function. And we won't be creating the outputs that we want in our businesses. Our bottom lines might not be going where we want them to go, simply based on that one fact. If we can have a reverence within our metrics almost in our work, are we having pauses? Are we having coaching times? Are we having reflective moments? In order to do that, we can then spring forward and learn. The power of pausing. Let's just try it now, wherever you are. Let's just pause. What do I want to achieve in the next month at work? What's the single point of focus? Let's pause on, what do I want my team to become in the next 6 months? Pause on those thoughts, pause on questions like that, so that you have time to actually see what is the most important thing. And this paradigm of pausing to spring forward, I often liken it to a bicycle. So when we're riding a bike, if we're always pushing on one pedal, we will lose balance. If we push on the other pedal, we will not be able to make the bike get its momentum. Often leadership, I think, is a bit like a bike. We're holding two tensions at the same time. And Noah Maxwell, he brings another beautiful paradox to the forefront of leadership.
It's apt that we're doing this on a podcast because it's audio. And out of that word audio come two other words that you would hear, which is authenticity and authority.
Oh, wow.
And I like the paradox and the sort of slight polarity of those two words, to be authentic and to have authority. And those are the lenses that I would always bring up to you, Dolly, or whoever it is in this company, and go, how do those show up? So authenticity is a huge word, and it's connected to kind of both sort of deep our soul of how much authenticity we're going to show. And it's also a very simple thing of like, is that the same person I know from the pub? So it's kind of up to you where you go with that. But that can involve how much vulnerability to show, how much sincerity, all of that. That's great.
Yeah.
And you need to own it and to take your confident place in where you want to stand.
Yeah.
And sometimes those two qualities can be almost paradoxical, authenticity and authority. Sometimes they completely overlap and you go, wow. So that's what I would say to look at. That's what I would question.
So authenticity and authority, another core thing in leadership. How do we carry both? And what does authority look like? Because it can sometimes be a bit of a dirty word that we've learnt from horrible headmasters at school or people who have abused power in places of authority. But I actually think authority is a really safe place when it's done with someone with good character. And how do you have good character if you're a leader? Well, you need to have self-awareness. So you need to understand what it's like to be on the other side of you. If you want to carry that mantle of leadership authority well, know what you're like, know what it's like to be on the other side of you, be open to hearing stuff that doesn't suit you and then working on how to resolve it and how to change your behavior. But authority, it's a confident place, and people need confidence in work. They need confidence in someone who is leading with decision and with direction. However, with leading with direction and clarity, going back to my word ordinary, I mean, it's pretty hard when we're in the ordinary minutiae of life, trying to execute plans and carry on with the day job, to be able to be in this place of, I definitely know what I'm doing is right. I know how to lead this team. You would be inhuman if you felt like that all the time. We can't feel like that. Leadership is often about unknowns, uncertainties, and just picking a lane of being decisive. Lots of options could be the right one. Which one are you going to choose? When I spoke to Dan Maudhub, I loved what he had to say on the implementation of leadership. Let's have a listen.
Because everyone wants a big idea that's going to change the world.
I know.
And I always say, well, if we could all just, if it was that simple, we'd all, A, be multimillionaires, B, we'd all be doing, you know, we all have the big ideas that can change the world, but it's the implementation, it's the daily change management and implementation that actually drives you towards your goals. So half of what we do, if not more, is project management. It's like leading the client day in, day out.
How do you keep the motivation going for that?
We're very results driven. So if you want to see a big change, then measure the small incremental changes.
Something that in what Dan shares is about this measuring of small things. Often when I come in and do leadership development programs or coaching or speaking, there's a hope that there's a new tool or there's a new way or there's some perfect answer, as though we can just rub a genie in a bottle and the genie will pop out and tell us this is the thing. And actually it's not. Life is about iterating, trying small adjustable things to move us towards a big goal. And something Dan says that I think is really key is measuring those small changes. And sometimes measuring is funny. We can often think it has to be some snazzy dashboard. It has to be some amazing piece of software that comes and measures performance or metrics or whatever they are. Actually, I love when I'm in the room with a team, I'll measure stuff just with Post-it notes. The old school ways are sometimes the best. You can just have in your team room 2 colors of Post-it notes, pink and blue. On pink, get them to write 3 things, 1 per Post-it note of what they think is going well in this team and 3 things that they think they need to work on in this team. Boom. You have got a metric right there, something to look at, something to talk about, something to have conversations about. You could have in your team, what is the one thing we need to focus on to be high performing in the next 6 months? One thing. Everyone writes their one thing in one color. What's the one thing that's distracting us at the moment in another color? Look at that. You then have data to have really robust conversations around moving the dial and adjusting and making small incremental changes to execute the goal, to execute the mission. As we bring this season into a land, I think what I've really enjoyed about this journey so far on the Extraordinary Leaders podcast is speaking to people and asking questions. I have learned so much just from doing this podcast about what's going on in the world in the spaces of leadership and development and high performance. And whatever sector you're in, I want to encourage you to ask questions. It comes back to this growth mindset. Be hungry to learn. Ask more questions, even if people give you information that isn't relevant or that you feel is a bit obvious. Find the meat and spit out the bones, because being part of a collective is about learning and cross-transferring. And we're living in a world now where we're so linear and isolated in our own spaces that we forget to get that peripheral vision. We forget to get that wide-angle lens. And I believe that is the essence of networking. It's the essence of career development, of business growth. Go and speak to people in other sectors, asking questions. If I was to boil all this down, I would say, how often are you asking questions, outside the box questions, and listening to the answers? How often are you asking the most simple questions? They don't always have to be outside the box. Simple questions. What's working well? That's a simple question. What's distracting us? What would make us better than our competitors? What's the one thing that would make us better than our competitors? What are the answers you're getting? questions are such an unlocking. They're like a nutcracker. They unlock such exponential potential to add extra into the ordinary. And of course, might make you and your business and your leadership something quite extraordinary. Thank you so much for joining me on season 3, the finale. I'm really excited about season 4, which will be coming up later in the summer. I've got some amazing guests lined up with a slight reframe of how we do it. So stay tuned. Please subscribe and follow me. You can find me on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on YouTube, and my book, The Extraordinary Leader. You can get a copy from my website, dollywaddell.com. And if you want help with self-awareness, people strategy, your leadership ability, coaching or speaking, please get in touch. I would love to collaborate with you. Thanks for joining.